All right, hi everybody. We're just getting started here. Let me get everything set up. See, I'm just doing attendance. Braden's here. Jacob's here. Cody's here. Whitehead's here. Access here. Jacobs is here. Nick is running this. Ethan's running this. All right, I'm just getting everybody marked down. W Brando. All right. Elizabeth Duval. I think I've got pretty much everybody marked down, so let's get started. So we left off in sixth block on, we had a pretty good debate going on socialism because Boyer had the slide and got a good debate going with some other people in the class on that. So we didn't get as far as we did in fourth block. So we'll kind of quickly catch up here and then get on to the further slides that we have. So for those of you in sixth block especially, this whole debate over, can we restructure economic systems to make it more equitable and fair, etc. That whole debate, oh, I got some new people showing up here. Josh. All right. That whole debate was, there was an attempt to see if that could happen, an experiment, so to speak, and that was under a wealthy industrialist from Scotland named Robert Owen. So, well, actually, he was Welsh, but yeah, and he made his fortune over in Britain as a factory owner, and ended up basically kind of donating $150,000 for 30,000 acres of land in what is now Indiana to create a commune known as New Harmony. And he basically he had taken it from a group of Germans who he had bought it at first and then decided to move back to Pennsylvania. But he ended up creating this kind of socialist experiment, so to speak. And he felt like if everybody was working for the common good and everybody pitched in, then this experiment in socialism would be a success. And so he put out a call for people to join this commune. And in doing so, you were going to forswear personal property of your own and kind of just pitch in and work for the common good. And It ends up not working out. There are some shady characters that get into the commune, and to make a long story short, it collapses after 3 years of effort in trying to make it work and trying to work things out. And so that basically is the first attempt to kind of see if the whole commune idea that had been put forward by Fourier could actually work. And the socialist utopia doesn't actually get realized. So that is the New Harmony Commune. Some people have their mics on. All right. And that takes us to the invention of photography, which, yeah, Robert had that, but he's no longer, he moved. Okay, so basically, this is something that is more AP Euro, AP World, but because it has such an effect on the United States, and obviously you're going to be seeing more photographs as we get further into the slides here, and it needs to be covered quickly. But this guy right here, Nicéphore Niépce, was a French inventor, and he noticed that if you put a certain chemical compound on a piece of paper and exposed it to sunlight, that it would kind of almost cast a shadow of what was in front of that piece of paper. And so he became interested in trying to capture a picture, so to speak, of what was in front of the camera with this thing that he called heliography, which really is the first photographs. And so he covered a piece of paper with silvered salts and then ended up capturing this first photograph, which is actually a dusty road in a village, and here are the buildings on either side and them casting shadows across the road. And it really took a long time for the photograph to expose using his method. Excuse me. So basically, he began to collaborate with another French inventor named Louis Daguerre, and the two of them refined the process, used lavender oil, and created a much faster way of getting photographs to expose called the FISA type photography, which many people just called daguerreotypes. And basically, it was just a box with a piece of film inside, and they would have and there would be a lens on the front, and they would take the lens off, and the photographer would have to have a person sit there for a little while until it exposed, and that was the first photographs. Looks like Nathan's rejoining us. All right, and so that takes us to Louis Braille, who Autumn, you picked this slide, so actually, if you would like to do it, because we did it in fourth block, but we never got to it in sixth block, I will let you take over. So go ahead.
Okay. He was born in 1809 in France, and at age 3, he was blinded by an accident because he was playing with his father's tools when one of them plunged into his right eye. This led to an infection, which then led to sympathetic ophthalmia. I don't know how to say that, which is total blindness. So he is now completely blind. As he grew up, he became a musician and an organist, very good at it. And then in 1819, after winning a scholarship, he attended the National Institute for Blind Children, which is one of the most prestigious institutes for blind people. At this school, Charles Barbier, he's a French officer, I believe, came to visit, and he showed the students there how he had carved dots into cardboard to symbolize phonetic sounds. And this is what they called night writing.
Yeah, and what was that? Why did soldiers have to have that? Like, what was that used for in, for instance, battles?
So they could just communicate without having to make noise.
Right. So if you're out on reconnaissance and you have to be absolutely silent, that was a way to keep the enemy from hearing you.
Uh-huh. And then at age 15, he took the 12 dot code that Charles Barbier showed him and made it into a 6 dot code. And this is pretty much the first braille that he made.
So he makes a
This was in
language.
1824.
Yeah, he makes a language.
And then it just
Right.
continued. Oh, what?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. And then, no, you're good, you're good. And then as life went on, he adapted it to music. He created a treatise, treatise about the system, which basically explained what it was in 1829. He made a Braille edition of a history schoolbook in 1837, and he died in 1852, but his legacy lived on and it spread worldwide throughout 1868.
Right. So again, this is a more AP Euro AP world, but because of its influence, we have to talk about it real quick. And yes, this writing system is going to allow people who are blind to participate more in society and become educated. So yeah, does anybody have any questions for Autumn on Louis Braille? All right. That system, by the way, is still in place. And if you've ever seen anyone reading a Braille book, it's really just kind of neat to uh, watch them reading as they're passing their fingers over pages. Just really kind of a neat thing. Um, all right, Autumn. And did you have any quotes,
Yeah,
videos?
I have a quote.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, it says access to communication in the widest sense is access to knowledge. And that is vitally important for us if we are not to go on being despised or patronized by consenting sighted people. We do not need pity, nor do we need to be reminded that we are vulnerable. We must be treated as equals, and communication is the way we can bring this about. And that just kind of explains the importance of why they needed to be able to communicate with other people.
Okay, and just also that just because your eyes are messed up doesn't necessarily mean that your mind is any less active or any less capable than the mind of a person who can see. So yeah, there was this tendency to kind of treat people who were invalids almost like they were children. So this is like, no, we are very capable as well. So that's Louis Braille. Great job, Amber. And that takes us to a slide which is shared by both Lizbeth and Trinity, and I don't think either one of them are in here. All right, so I'll take care of this, and then I'll get with them on how they want to do their slides. But basically, we have a number of blind and deaf people in our country, and they really were considered, and there's just kind of this broad spectrum of people with various issues that were all considered invalids, okay? And so they were inside often, the family was kind of responsible for taking care of them, but you know, eventually there will be institutions as well. And reformers wanted to kind of change this and allow people who were blind and deaf to get into society and participate in society. So one of the there's two people that we need to mention right here. We have Thomas Hopkins Galladay and Samuel Gridley Howe. Thomas Galladay was a graduate of Yale who could have become a minister, but because of his health decided not to, and instead he became a tutor. And he learned some methods that had been developed in Britain for teaching young people who were deaf. And he came back to America and founded the first school for deaf students, which was the American School for the Deaf in Connecticut in 1817. And Samuel Gridley Howe became the first director of the Perkins Institute in Massachusetts, which used the system that had just been developed of Braille to teach the blind. And he kind of pioneered its use in this country. And yes, Chase, go ahead.
Before all of this went down, did they have like certain classrooms for disabled people in schools that were already established, or was this more like the first?
That's actually an excellent question. And the answer is kids who were blind or deaf didn't go to school. they were considered invalids. And so if you were an invalid, which there could be a whole host of things that could, cause someone to be an invalid. They could be born with special needs. They could have a mental issue of some sort. But it was just kind of a broad sweeping category. Or they could have a physical disability of some sort, including being blind or deaf. Generally speaking, schools did not teach them. They're like, we're just not equipped to do it. We are just equipped to teach students who are capable of, doing what is required in a school. And so this is where we start to see the first schools that are developed for that. But since you have to use different methodology to teach, either someone who is deaf or someone who's blind, you have Thomas Gallaudet using sign language with deaf students, and you have Samuel Gridley Howe using Braille with blind students, and so they were able to learn as a result. But yes, great question, Chase. Anyone else on the advocates for the blind and the deaf? All right, so that takes us to another important Supreme Court case, Ogden v. Saunders. Okay, so again, this has to do with our contracts, like absolute. So far in all the cases that we have covered, the power of contracts cannot be violated. The Supreme Court has upheld them. It's important for the business world for people to trust that if they make a contract with somebody, it is enforceable in court. Like you're just not willing to do business if there's a way for people to kind of worm their way out of a contract. But there is a situation that people get into sometimes where they get so indebted that they just can't pay their debts. And the solution back at this time, which was part, deterrent, part, a way to get some money out of them, was to throw them in what was known as a debtor's prison, where they literally lost their freedom and were stuck in prison to pay off their debts. And in the case Mason v. Hale in 1827, the Supreme Court ruled that it was within the authority of state governments to outlaw this practice, which had been around forever, to throw people in prison for debts. And when a man named George Ogden, who was living in New York, tried to absolve himself of his debts that he owed to a guy named John Saunders in Kentucky, using new bankruptcy laws that were passed in the state of New York, Saunders appealed this, these state court decisions all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And so in a 4-3 decision, with Justice Bushrod Washington writing one of 4 separate opinions on this, the court basically said that, yes, there are limits to the power of contracts. And if somebody is bankrupt, then states can pass bankruptcy laws which would allow people to allow creditors to get money from them without throwing them in prison and completely taking away their freedom. So this is one of the important limits that was set on the power of contracts, which was the allowing for various bankruptcy laws passed by states to kind of stand as a way for debtors to reorganize themselves and get out of debt, and a way for their creditors to get money. Yes, Eiley. Go ahead, Eiley.
Is there any time when the Supreme Court's constantly doing power grabs? Is there any time when there's a big court case where they don't, or they just can't grab any more power?
Actually,
is there a limit to what they're adding?
That's a very timely question, because that actually applies to this case. In this case, let me ask you, do you feel like the feds are grabbing more power here, or do you feel like this is giving power to the states, or confirming the power of the states?
What was the decision reached?
Basically, the decision was that states do have the authority to pass bankruptcy laws, and that contracts, like the the sanctity of contracts had been upheld all the way to this point. But this is one exception when it comes to the sanctity of contracts, that there is a solution for people who are so heavily in debt that they can't get out. And so therefore, the Supreme Court is saying, we're not going to overthrow these bankruptcy laws passed by the states. We're going to say that that states do have the right to make these laws. And there can be an option other than debtor's prison for people who are very heavily in debt. So is that a power grab, or is that actually something where the Supreme Court is allowing the states to kind of decide things and staying out of it, so to speak?
Well, I can kind of see it in both ways, because like the states are grabbing. It's more of the states doing a power grab because they're able to, pass these laws to help people get out of debt. But the fact that the Supreme Court is well, no, it would be the states, because the Supreme Court basically decides a lot of things anyway.
Okay, yeah, I think you're right. I think that this is definitely one of the few cases that we see where the feds don't grab more power. Ethan, what were you going to say?
I would say in this case, it would be more like indirect and a bit more, not as obvious, but I feel like this would be sort of, grounds so that they can find loopholes and ways to, get out of some tenuous agreements and contracts.
Well, okay, but like each state is going to have to make its own set of bankruptcy laws. I mean, and what do the creditors want? What do the people who are the ones who are owed money? What do they want here? They want
Money.
Well, yeah, and what do they want to do to the debtor? Do they want the debtor to be able to like use bankruptcy laws to kind of
They honestly don't really. They just want the debts to be paid. They don't want them to just kind of dodge it.
Right. So they would rather have them, like thrown in debtor's prison so they can like kind of get, forced labor out of the person until their debts are paid. And of course, that scares people into paying their debts because they don't want to go to debtor's prison. So they want the more draconian version. But I feel like the Supreme Court here is saying that this is just, you people shouldn't be losing their freedom over debts. I mean, yes, you may be a wreck financially, but you shouldn't be thrown in prison for that.
But we do know that eventually later on in history, possibly hundreds of years, this will lead to a lot of shenanigans with bankruptcy and under companies specifically.
Oh, sure. Yeah, loopholes, etc. Right. And some companies trying to kind of survive using the bankruptcy laws when they get in over
And
there.
how it's like the workers, they get the ones who have to pay their dues while the company just kind of skirts along.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, like no system's perfect. Everybody's going to find loopholes. Cody, what were you going to add? Cody, you had your hand up.
I just had a question.
Yeah.
I have a question about the two prisons, like the debtor prison and action prison. Are they the same or are they different somewhat?
You could be put in prison with the general population for debt, but in some larger cities, there were separate areas for people who were in prison for debt, which separated them from the rest of the prison population, which were in there for crimes. So you wouldn't have to necessarily be in the same area as murderers, but it all depends on the size of the municipality. So for a smaller municipality, you're going to be thrown in there with everybody else. But for a larger one, you basically got to kind of be in a separate area. It's kind of funny. One of the 13 colonies was actually started when Britain was looking to empty out some of its debtors' prisons in its larger cities. Does anybody know, or does anybody remember which one of the 13 colonies was actually populated by people who had been in debtor's prison, who were given a chance to kind of get their freedom if they would go to the New World and be colonists over there?
It's
Anybody?
Georgia.
Georgia, very good. Yes, so Georgia is correct, and actually, Australia is another British colony that was also populated by people who were given the option of going, and being colonists rather than staying in debtor's prison. Did that answer your question, Cody?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
All right, yeah. So I think you forgot to
Can I ask
raise your
a
hand.
question?
Yeah, absolutely.
How long would they be in there? Would they just be in there for as long as it took until they paid it off, or?
Generally speaking, that was what it was. You would, when you were in debtor's prison, you were forced to work. And so debtor's prisons actually produced products, which were then sold for a profit. And part of the money went to the state, but part of the money went to paying off your debts. But it was a really slow process. So you wouldn't make a lot of money. And so you'd be in there until you paid your debts off, which could take a long time depending on how much debt you were in. It's just a very different world from what we're used to. We're not used to kind of, that draconian level of punishment for, not paying your debts. Ethan, what were you going to add?
Oh, I was just saying, like, at the time when debtors' prisons were common, were like interest rates like common in contracts,
Banks were
or is
sometimes
it just like,
notorious. I mean, The Merchant of Venice, right? The Shakespeare play where they kind of characterize Shylock and the other bankers as evil because of the high interest they charge. Interest rates had been around forever. It was all a matter of, are you stupid enough to take out a loan from a person who charges high interest? If you are, then it's your fault for getting yourself into this mess. I mean, you shouldn't have.
yeah, I think though that would lead to situations where, oh, it says my internet connection is unstable.
Okay, yeah, I can still hear you. You're fine. You're not breaking up.
Okay. Yeah, so I feel like that would lead to situations where a person would just be in debtor's prison forever because the interest rates would just keep on stacking.
Oh, I got you. Yeah, like normally interest stops accruing and you would just end up like having to pay off whatever debt you
Yeah.
owed when you
I
went.
thought like debtor's prison was just common for like, if you had like a lump sum you
Right.
had to pay.
No, like you could once you got into a certain situation where you literally couldn't pay your debts, you were so indebted you couldn't pay your debts. That was a pretty common way of solving that. And again, various courts and various jurisdictions had different standards for exactly when they would decide to throw somebody into debtor's prison, which of course is something that nobody wanted to have happen to them. Faith,
And
go ahead.
it's like, yeah, and there would always be the situations where it's like, oh, is it the person who's dumb enough to take the loan, or is it the bank that's predatory enough to give out that type of loan?
Well, yeah, and of course people were, and Parliament is going to pass laws on, restricting predatory lending, I guess is what you could call it, and the various states are going to do that as well. I'm trying to remember if they're what the first federal laws are. I think there's not. I can't remember exactly, but I don't think the feds get involved in it for a while. I think it is left up to the states to kind of figure out how to kind of stop really predatory lending practices. But you just have to remember that there's not as much regulation of the economy at this time. Like the government has a tendency to stay out of the business world more than it gets itself involved. I mean, unless you have situations where it's really necessary, the government tends to stay out of it. Faith, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to mention a lot of people who worked in banks, like a lot of people would be desperate for money. And so they would take the loan despite the super high interest rate because they needed money right then. But then they realized when the time came to pay the debt off, they were like, oh crap, I don't have the money. I took out like a $500 loan and the interest rate is like 40%. And it was just outrageous. So
Well,
a
yeah.
lot of people took advantage of the other people.
Well, and especially when it came to things like land speculation, where you were buying land out west and you were hoping that it would go up in value so you could get mega rich quick, but a lot of times it didn't work out. You didn't pick the right plot of land, people didn't move to the area, whatever, and so you end up in this situation where, you're just you're left holding the bag, and suddenly debtor's prison becomes a reality, a very possible reality. And yeah, you're staring down.
Yeah, a lot of people were.
Yeah, you're just looking at the ruination of your entire life, many of your best years spent in a debtor's prison. So it's much riskier, and the stakes are higher, at this time when it comes to finances. All right. So in 1828, there was a new tariff that had to be considered by Congress. And there is a division in the country over whether or not to place this tariff on uh, the products coming in from Britain mostly, because businesses in the North are now producing their own goods. So do you think they would rather see a high tariff on British goods or a low tariff? Anybody? Like, what would they prefer if they were making their own goods? Like, say, for instance, you're making shirts and you wanted, your shirts to sell in competition to British shirts. So Braden, go ahead.
Well, I think obviously they want like a high tariff on British goods because they're like, hey, we want our own. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just barely. You're very, very faint. But yeah, you're saying they would like a high tariff. I did hear you say that.
Yeah, they want a high tariff on British goods because they're like, we want our own economy to flourish. So we want to make it to where like people are more inclined to buy American-made goods so that we have more going on in our own country.
Right. Okay. So businesses in the North want this. They want it, want it, want it. Zach, what were you going to say?
So I was going to say, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So I was going to say that the British, or not the British, the North, that it's a very good idea because they, as Braden said, they would like their own economy. But the South sells most of their goods to the British.
Right.
So if there's going to be a higher tax on the British goods, then the British are also going to raise the tax on our goods. So then it's going to create a very bad economy for the South.
Right. So and actually the South is selling them cotton, like.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry.
Yeah. No, but you actually just went ahead and talked about the very next thing we were going to get to. So very good. Yeah. So this is what we call this reciprocity. Like, if you raise your tariffs on a country's goods, they'll raise their tariffs on your goods. It's a way of like deterring, people from like overdoing the tariff thing, is to say, well, if you're going to raise yours, we're going to raise ours. So the South is going to get hurt if this high tariff gets passed. Go ahead, Chase.
Wouldn't that also cause more slavery tensions to rise because they're farmers down south are losing their money? They're going to want more labor out of the slaves due to the taxes.
You're talking about like tension between masters and slaves, or you're talking about like tensions over whether slavery should exist between North and South?
Between masters and slaves.
Oh yeah, well of course they're going to drive them harder, to continue to maintain their profit margins. Sure, but the South had always been very anxious that the much more populous North was going to, basically deny them their rights and treat them, as less than equal. And now they were starting to see this happen with this tariff. So there was all of this pressure on John Quincy Adams not to sign the tariff. And the guy who led that effort was his own vice president. You may remember he kind of ran unopposed for the vice president slot in 1824, John C. Calhoun, who represented the plantation owners of the South. So John Quincy Adams faced one of those situations where if he signs it's kind of, actually, he's between a rock and a hard place, like, because if he signs it, the North is going to be happy and the South is going to be unhappy. But if he doesn't sign it, the North will be happy and the South will be happy. So but he just is like, you know what, I'm just going to do what's best for the country. I'm going to just analyze this and see if this is going to help our economy or hurt it. And his analysis basically showed that it would be helpful to the overall economy of the country, and so he signs it. And the South is apoplectic. They are absolutely beside themselves. And so his own vice president basically goes down to South Carolina and looks for a resolution in the South Carolina legislature. And he basically makes a speech which gets turned into a pamphlet called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, where he argues that this is where the states need to exercise this power that had really been usurped by the Supreme Court. But states were like, well, we can do it too. the power of nullification. So does anybody remember from when we talked about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which nullified the Alien and Sedition Acts? What is nullification?
It's
Go ahead.
where if they don't consider a law constitutional, they can just ignore it, basically.
Yeah, so within the borders of a state, they're just going to say, you know what, we don't recognize this federal law as effective. And so, of course, that's going to create chaos because you're going to have like federal laws not being valid in various states. And so, of course, this is kind of setting the country up for a crisis, which we're going to get to as we get further in. But before we do, we need to kind of talk about some things that will end up leading to Andrew Jackson getting into power. So see here, Alec has the New Democracy, but he's not here, so I'll just do it. So during the era of good feelings, there were various experiments within states to expand the amount of suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. And what they were looking to do, and this is something that is being paralleled over in Britain, is there is pressure for what is known as white universal manhood suffrage, which is that all white males would be able, or universal white manhood suffrage, I've got it there in quotes, where all white males who were in a particular state could vote. And so really this was getting rid of the quote property requirements for voting that a lot of states had in place, because they wanted the more gentlemanly class, the more well-to-do, the more well-educated to be the ones who are voting. And so this is really more poor white men versus richer white men. And in the states out west, especially, you start to see state legislatures begin to pass laws that enact universal white manhood suffrage. And of course, when one state has it, then people in another state get jealous of the fact that the people in one state have it and they don't. And so that kind of has this snowball effect. And before you know it, white universal manhood suffrage was now basically being enacted in states all across the country. And that then in turn is going to put pressure on state legislatures to say, you know what, we're not just going to send electors to the Electoral College. And we already talked about this in the election of 1824. But a lot of the major parties were now going to basically say, okay, we will select our presidential electors by looking at the popular vote. And, there's the various options. You can say, well, the percentage of the popular vote they get is the percentage of the electors they get. But of course, it's even more high stakes for your state if you say winner take all. You get over 50%, you get them all. So then, of course, candidates have to come out to your state. They have to make promises. They have to try to win your vote. And many states move to the winner take all. Eiley, what were you going to say?
You said, yeah. You mentioned that it's just a question of mine. You mentioned that parties could vote. I thought there was only one party as of now.
Well, you're going to see. We're going to get to there will be two parties because of what happens within because of the corrupt bargain of 1824. So this slide is a little bit of an overview slide. It does extend into the future a little bit. So as we move into the new party era that we're just about to talk about, like on the very next slide, you'll see that it does kind of, candidates for the major parties are now starting to, they'll have their what is called their slate of electors. So if a party wins a particular state, then they have a certain number of people from their party who are going to go to the Electoral College and cast votes for their particular candidate. But also you see some more changes in parties as well, as the party bigwigs had basically kind of had these closed door meetings called caucuses. And they were so powerful, the party bigwigs, in determining who would be the candidate for a party, that these were known as King Caucus. So, and this was again kind of this attempt to prevent mobocracy, which had run amok over in France during the French Revolution, or King Mob, as it was often called, where people who could kind of rouse up the rabble but weren't necessarily people of good character or people who would do a good job be able to just by force of charisma and personality get into public office. And so there's kind of this tension over uh, who gets to decide who the candidate is for the party, and who gets to decide who wins the electoral vote in a particular state. Just to make a long story short, and because it's different state by state, we are moving more and more towards all people who are white males being allowed to have suffrage, or being allowed to vote, and being allowed to influence all of these decisions. So this is kind of the new democracy that develops in the 1820s. And of course, this is going to have a huge impact on the campaign of 1828. Now, the Republican Party as we know it does not really come into existence until right before the Civil War. Yes, Nick.
When you were talking about I know this was like the whole concept of the last slide, but I'm just kind of making sure they were able to vote for the members of the electoral college now, right? Or is for
Okay. So the popular vote is going to determine the electoral vote, and that is actually a state decision. So each state kind of makes that decision, but as they see other states doing it, and then they're like watching as candidates come out and start making speeches and start making promises to other states around them. We're like, well, gee, I wish they'd do that for us. And so more and more states continue to kind of move in that direction. There is no federal mandate. This is all decisions made by states. But yes, everything kind of shifts in that direction in the 1820s. And again, people felt like the gentlemanly class kind of screwed the common people out of their choice in 1824, and Andrew Jackson just amplified that with his corrupt bargain of 1824 kind of narrative. So that also adds fuel to the fire to shift over to where the popular vote is going to determine the electoral vote in pretty much every state, and that it becomes more winner take all. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. And so again, so there's no confusion. This is not the Republican Party, what you see here with John Quincy Adams. This is what we call the National Republicans. And the National Republicans are more like, hey, let's keep those old era of good feelings, American system kind of things in place, where we had these Federalist policies, and we kept them, like the Second Bank of the United States and the American system of Henry Clay. And Andrew Jackson had demonized the Second Bank of the United States. As a matter of fact, during the Panic of 1819, he kind of spread this false notion and was influenced by this false notion that it was bankers who had caused the entire thing. And that really the Panic of 1819 was their fault. And if we could just keep the bankers from wrecking things for all of us regular people, us common folk, then we wouldn't have these problems. And so I see a couple of hands here. So Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add, or did you just forget to put your hand down?
I forgot to put my hand down.
Oh, okay. Ethan, go ahead. Ethan? Oh, it looks like Ethan may have lost his connection.
Sorry, I just accidentally clicked it or something.
Oh, okay. All right, Dylan, did you want to say?
Did the era of good feelings extend outside of politics, or was it just strictly in politics?
We call it's actually a name for an era in politics. So we call it the era of good feelings because it has to do with, just a lack of political rancor. But does that play into more amicable relations outside of politics? Sure. I mean, people don't feel like they're on opposite teams anymore. It's more about personality than it is about which party are you for, kind of thing. So it does have an effect on things outside of it, but it's not just kind of like this natural like thing where everybody in the whole country is just feeling good vibes, you know, like it's more, you know, a political kind of, it is a name given to a political era. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Does that answer your question? All right, I'm going to assume so. Or yes, I see your mic coming back on.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, good. Valicia, go ahead.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead or anything, but didn't Andrew Jackson primarily provoke the idea that any ordinary person could hold office?
Yeah, he's a common man. He's not part of the gentlemanly class. He's this, you know, rough and ready kind of militia leader out of Tennessee who would get in bar fights all the time, and the gentlemanly class would like look down upon and disdain. So the fact that he actually is able to win the presidency, which we're about to get to, is going to have a huge impact on whether or not common folk, so to speak, could hold public office, and you know, just the impression as to whether they should even run or not, and then of course whether they should win. Eiley, what did you have to say? Eiley?
Sorry, kind of a semi-serious question.
Yeah.
During all of this, like with all these parties being made, do you think other countries were looking at the US like, whoa, they're whack? Or just kind of like looking upon us and wondering what's going on? Or did any of them get involved at any point?
Okay.
Like the elections today, some countries get involved?
Oh, to influence our elections, not unless there's some kind of like war going on, like where, you know, you had Citizen Genet trying to get people, you know, involved, like trying to get our country involved in France's wars. Generally speaking, no, but they kind of looked at us with this sort of fascination, thinking at any moment the Americans will tear themselves apart because their, you know, democracy is too unstable. You know, our system, which is a monarchy, is much better, you know, in certain areas. Of course, France was now a republic, and of course they had a democracy. Britain had a constitutional monarchy with some democratic elements that were kind of like becoming more and more prominent as time went by. But for the most part, everybody was kind of waiting for us to fall apart. Like the French experiment had gone wildly out of control, so they were thinking, well, democracy is just too unstable, and the Americans eventually are going to suffer the same fate. So that's kind of how things are seen. Did that answer your question?
Oh. Yeah, it was honestly a curiosity of mine.
Yeah. That's an excellent question. And then Faith, what were you going to add?
Speaking of other countries, has Britain already abolished slavery? Because I know that they did that a fair bit before we did. Has that already happened, or is that about to happen?
Officially by an act of parliament with the British slave trade, William Wilberforce. I want to say, what is that? Is that the 1830s that happens, or not? I want to say it's already happened, but it might be right around this time. My memory on exactly what year that happens is a little off. If anybody wants to look it up and just, you know, all you have to do is put in Wilberforce, William Wilberforce into Google and just look it up just to be sure. But because I want to say 1803 or 1830 something. Does anybody have that real quick? Let me just look that up real fast.
I was just curious.
No, it's a good question. And, you know, I teach AP Euro, so this is usually in my brain, but, you know, not every detail stays in your brain forever. So,
I found it.
okay. And what does it say?
It says in 1807.
1807. Okay, great. So yeah, so it has been. I wanted to say that it did, but I was like, I couldn't be sure in my memory if I was right or not.
And did Britain doing that, did that influence us at all? Like when
sure.
they abolished it?
We abolished the international slave trade in 1808, but that was, and Southerners were okay with that because of the, you know, like no more kidnapping people from Africa, but because enough kids were being born that they would have a new, you know, group of slaves to work with, you know, domestically, that they didn't need new slaves being brought in from Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and
But
of
did
course,
any of the, sorry, did any of the abolitionists, did they argue, well, Britain got rid of it and they're doing fine, like we should too? Was that
yes.
like something that the abolitionists thought?
Yes, yes, that was also that was definitely part of kind of the abolitionist rhetoric, and of course, Britain didn't have part of their economy, based on slavery, kind of like we did, and so people in the South, of course, are very much against it. People in the North, because William Wilberforce was appealed to in many senses by his Christian. Kind of to his Christian morals. William Wilberforce actually had talked to a slave trader, a guy who had had a slave ship and had kidnapped people from Africa and sent them to the New World on a regular basis, who had had a conversion to Christianity later in his life, who became then an ardent abolitionist and had penned one of the great hymns of Christianity, Amazing Grace. So, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound to save a wretch like me. What he was referring to was he was a wretch. He was a slave trader. He traded in people. And so, really, the fuel for much of the abolitionist fire was Christian faith, and a real sincere Christian faith. And so, yes, that is very much something that influences the the people in the abolitionist movement in the United States, especially because of kind of the similar motivations that they have due to their faith. And then, Eiley, I'm not sure if you have your hand up still, or if you had just forgotten to put it down. You just
No,
okay.
I just forgot to put it down. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Scott.
And thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right.
Scott,
I don't really know how to word this, but you said Europe thought America would just kind of crash at any time. So did they have like forces ready? So when America did crash, they could just kind of take over?
No, we're hillbillies. We're a bunch of rubes. Okay, they're like those Americans. Like they have bigger fish to fry, so to speak. Like if Britain really wanted to like recapture its old colonies, the opportunity was the War of 1812. Like they were already stomping us. We had given them an excuse to do it, but they didn't. They were like, okay, Napoleon's back. All right, hey, let's just call this good, and we took them up on the deal. But there wasn't an enormous amount of uh, wanting to like retake America. Now, the Spanish colonies are a different story. You will see an attempt by the French to take Mexico in the 1860s. And that was under Napoleon's nephew or grandnephew, Napoleon III, when he becomes kind of the president of France and then turns France into an empire again. So he's trying to reestablish the greatness of the French Empire by getting control of Mexico, but it doesn't work. The Mexican people are able to fight him off. We'll actually talk about it when we get to the 1860s. But yeah, if Mexico is strong enough to fight off colonialists, we definitely are strong enough. It would just be it would be way too much effort to do that. So, but that's an excellent question. All right, so let's just get into to kind of the back and forth of this campaign, because Jackson is mega popular, and most states now are going to use the electoral vote reflecting the popular vote and winner take all kind of setup. And Scott, you still have your hand up. Did I answer your question, or?
Yeah, I just forgot to take it down. My bad.
Oh, no problem. And so Jackson really campaigns against the bank, the second bank of the United States, and against the money lenders and the money interests, etc. And his reputation as a war hero and as an Indian fighter out in the West really makes him into a powerful political force. The Republicans decide, okay, if we're going to go after this guy, we have to go after him on a personal level. They're going to dig up dirt. And they found out that actually he had not nullified, or I'm sorry, his wife, Rachel Jackson, had not nullified her first marriage. So when he had married her technically he had committed the crime, or she had committed the crime of bigamy, where you're married to more than one person at the same time. And so this will become a big kind of, way to attack Jackson. He's a bigamist. You can't vote for this guy. He's married to more than one person, or he's married to a woman who's married to more than one person at the same time. And so for the first two, now Rachel had nullified that marriage eventually, but for the first 2 years that they were married, she was actually married to more than one person. So she was a bigamist, and by extension, Jackson was, okay with bigamy, kind of thing. And so they were trying to kind of use that as a way to, attack Jackson personally. And of course, Jackson made it seem like John Quincy Adams was corrupt and was in the hands of the moneyed interest of the country. And you can see here that it is just an overwhelming electoral victory for Jackson, even though the popular vote is closer. And had New York gone winner take all, it would have been even more resounding victory for Jackson. But this is kind of what we call the birth of modern politics in 1828, because from here on out, you're going to have campaigns that have to have a presence in every state, that have to go and make speeches and knock on doors and do all the things that campaigns do. And in order to do that, you've got to have a way to motivate people to work for your campaign, because now it's based on the popular vote. It's not just the electors being picked by state legislatures. So the age of the gentleman presidents is over. And the first kind of common man president to enter office is Andrew Jackson. He's not a member of the genteel class, even though he does have a very nice plantation which you can now visit. It's called the Hermitage. But he kind of has this reputation anyway of, just from his earlier days, of being this kind of common man war hero kind of thing. And of course, it's the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812 that turns him into a national hero. He's just, seen as a man of the people. And Nathan, what were you going to say?
This is my slide.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll stop. So you go ahead and pick up on Andrew Jackson.
So Andrew Jackson, like you said, was the first president who was like not completely educated, and especially from the South. He wasn't like a rich white aristocrat who owned like plantations, who became like a politician.
Yeah.
He was born in South Carolina to a generally poor family, and during the War of Independence, he would lose his mother and two brothers, and then his family would move to Tennessee. During that war, he was kidnapped by a British soldier, or took him prisoner, I guess, and they tried to force him to wash the officer's boot, and he denied, and the officer struck him across the face, leaving lasting scars. They would move to Nashville, and he would grow up in the Hermitage, and his family would generally grow out of poverty, and he would eventually become a politician. But at this point, he wasn't really popular yet on like the national stage in our country until, of course, the War of 1812 and the Battle of New Orleans and Horseshoe Bend, where he got really popular for his military action. After he would get popular, he would raise an army to attack Florida to try to take it from the Spanish. But of course, and this would lead to like talk about Florida in American politics, leading to John Quincy Adams eventually being able to like negotiate it from the the Spanish.
That was the first Seminole War that we talked about. But go ahead.
Eventually, as he got more popular, people began to want him to run for president. So he did, and then he lost, of course, to John Quincy Adams, but he still won the popular vote. We already went over that, so I'll just move on. When he finally got to the White House, he was involved in a scandal where people said that since his wife never divorced from her previous husband, that it was adultery.
What ends up happening to his wife, by the way?
She ends up dying like 4 years later.
Yeah, and who does he blame for that?
He blames the people who said all those things about her because he thinks it like stressed her out to lead her to her death.
Yeah, and so he will be very bitter about that. We're going to talk about it when we get to the next campaign, but go ahead.
He would also go on to be like the first frontier president and would be called Old Hickory. And he had a really strong personality and would really force his like positions in politics. And so the Whig Party would eventually call him King Andrew the First because of how forceful he was in politics.
Yeah, he just has this really kind of raw personality. If we were to compare him to a modern politician, what modern politician really kind of almost immediately strikes you as having some strong similarities to Andrew Jackson?
I don't know. I guess Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, in a lot of ways, Trump, he's like the Trump of the 1830s. Like he's, because Trump is rich, but everybody sees him as a man who is like for the common people. And Andrew Jackson is rich. He has a big plantation, but everybody sees him as this man who's for the common people. Now, of course, Trump's not a war hero or anything like that, but there are some striking similarities. So it's not like that method that Trump is using right now to gain popularity. It's not like that hasn't worked before, because it actually has worked before in American politics. And Andrew Jackson is a great example of that. Go ahead.
One of the major like political arguments at the time was the Bank of the United States, mainly between Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, where the charter for it was going to expire, and he thought that the bank was just used for like rich bank owners.
Okay, and don't talk about like what happens to the second bank like during his administration, because we're going to get to that. That's actually like a separate slide. So
Okay.
so hold off on that. Tell me a little bit about what was known as his quote kitchen cabinet. What is that?
Like his cabinet?
Well, at the bottom of the slide, you see it. I have it underlined. His kitchen cabinet.
Well, I didn't really do anything on that. Most of the stuff I did was like the Trail of Tears and the tariff.
That's not a problem. That's not a problem. Zachary, did you have a question for Nathan?
No, so I actually do know what the kitchen cabinet is.
Oh, okay. Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, so the kitchen cabinet is actually where he like took different bureaucrats out of government positions, and he put like, I guess you would say, regular people in those positions, and that actually, well, actually, I know what it does with the Eaton affair. Like I know a lot about that, but
yeah. But don't get into the Eaton affair because we have.
I won't. Yeah. It's just like that's what they are. They're regular people in government positions.
Okay, and what he often does is he'll like, in the kitchen of the White House, like he'll kind of come in there and hang out and grab some food and stuff. And those people will often kind of walk into the kitchen as well. And he'll have these conversations with them. And those conversations that he has with either individual, like rough and ready people like him, or a group of them, will eventually actually kind of influence policy more than his actual formal cabinet. So he's kind of looking to these common man sorts of people that he has put into positions for advice, and kind of what is the pulse of the people, what do the people want, etc., than he is listening to his own actual cabinet on some issues. All right, anything else, Nathan, on Andrew Jackson?
So he would eventually, because of the tariffs that were happening between the North and South, South Carolina would try to just ignore them or like null and void them. And while Andrew Jackson, I think,
don't get into the nullification crisis. Sorry, that's all like coming up too. So sorry.
Okay, I'm just gonna say that I think it's interesting what he did in it, because he would also allow for white settlers to break native treaties, federal native treaties.
Yeah, we're going to talk about all that too. Yeah, we're going to talk about the Indian Removal Act and all of that good stuff. So that's all coming up. But just anything in general on his character, kind of his personal life, etc., that you have that goes along with who he is as a person and just as a president.
He mainly just made it available for like ordinary people to become president.
Okay.
And he would solidify the Democratic Party as like one of the major parties in the United States.
Yeah, there's a funny story where they have the inaugural ball, when he's inaugurated. It's kind of like a party after the inauguration. And usually you have the glitterati, you know, of society all coming, and they're all dressed very nicely and everything. But Andrew Jackson had a giant cheese wheel brought in where you could just grab like a little piece of cheese off of it, which was considered very uncouth by this genteel class. And he invited common people who normally would never get an invitation to the inaugural ball to this inaugural ball. And as they came in, they didn't wipe their shoes. Their shoes weren't nice and clean like all of the genteel people. They had mud on their boots, and the mud got tracked all over the very nice carpets of the White House. And so the genteel class people were all very horrified, you know, and Andrew Jackson, you know, was kind of seen. This is just another example of how he is seen as a man of the people. But really, this is the birth of modern politics, where modern politicians have to appeal to the people. And Zach, did you have your hand up for a reason, or did you just forget to put it down?
I totally just forgot.
Okay, no problem. Chase, what were you going to say?
Did this appeal to like the people? Did that become a main selling point for every president, or was it just a craze for Andrew Jackson?
Well, you have to a certain extent, get the people on your side, because how do you determine the electoral vote in every state? Is it
Popular vote?
By the popular vote? So you have to get like a certain number of popular people. Let me flip back to that on your side. So yeah, to a certain extent, politics will never be the same again. Like you have to appeal to the people. Like you have to present yourself in a way. And you don't necessarily have to be a man of the people. You just have to be something that the people want at that particular time. And Nick, what were you going to say?
It's more along the lines of what Chase just asked about how he like kind of had the people in, and it was just kind of for the popular vote. But was there any other kind of like ulterior like motive for him kind of just surrounding himself with common or more common people, or is that mainly just to get kind of the people's vote on his side?
Well, I mean, I to a certain extent, I think he really does believe what he preaches. He believes that the genteel class, that the money lending class, the bankers, etc., they're the enemy of the common people. That they're the ones who created the Panic of 1819. Like he believes it deep down. So he wants common people who are who believe, you know, what he does, that, you know, hey, we need to kind of take this country back from these elites, so to speak. He wants more of them involved in politics. He wants to hear their advice. He wants to know what the people want. He wants to have his kind of his finger on the pulse of the people. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not. Is that kind of what you were asking, or?
Yeah, that definitely answers the question. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. All right, yeah. So again, a lot of great questions. Andrew Jackson is a pivotal figure, very important, and of course, we'll see how pivotal he is as we get further into him. Now, of course, he's also very controversial. There are people who would love to see his picture be taken off the $20 bill, and they would love to see statues of him being torn down. As a matter of fact, there was a group this summer that was going to tear down his statue in Washington, D.C., before they were stopped by the feds. But a lot of it has to do with his very harsh treatment of minorities, in particular Native Americans, but also, you know, he's a slave owner and is very much in favor of slavery. Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
So don't they want to replace him with Harriet Tubman?
They
on the
do.
$20
They
bill?
do on the $20 bill, which would be it would be really kind of neat to see Harriet Tubman in a
Yeah.
prominent position.
It really would.
Yeah, because I mean, it's every time I talk about her, I'm go back to like you couldn't make a Hollywood movie that is as crazy as her life is. I mean, she's just an amazing person, a real hero in a lot of ways. So it would be nice to see her honored as well. And so I think she definitely deserves it. All right, so let's get back to just like the whole organization of politics, because you have, if you're going to appeal to the people, you have to have an organization. It's just too much for one person to do. Like, you can't just go out and shake everybody's hand if you're a presidential candidate. There's just too many people. You know, you see Trump trying to kind of almost do that with his rallies, you know, just get out there and be with the people, like interact with them, but there's just too many. And so, and there's too many states, and there's too many different things going on in different states where, you know, that are issues in those states. And so really you need a network, you need a nationwide campaign organization. But like, how are you going to get people to volunteer that much time? Like, you know, if you can't pay them all, which, I mean, Andrew Jackson was rich, but he wasn't that rich. The only other way that you could reward them would be with jobs in the executive branch, because the president is the one who can hire or fire anybody in the executive branch. It's a top-down organization. And so Andrew Jackson comes up with a system that would actually become a set system in politics all the way until the 1880s, when it finally is, it kind of leads to the assassination of a president, and it finally is reformed, called the spoils system. And this comes from the little phrase, "To the victor belong the spoils." Like, if you win the war, you get to enjoy the loot, so to speak. And so essentially, the argument is made that, well, if you win, you should be able to fill the executive branch with people that you want in there. And of course, Andrew Jackson is also trying to kind of boot out these genteel class people, and put in his own people. You know, again, you know, the whole war in the bureaucracy right now with Trump and the deep state is all, there's some very strong parallels in a lot of ways, and just in, you know, in my opinion. But basically, he began removing bureaucrats and replacing them with people who had worked for his campaign in various states. And there was this kind of unspoken, but everybody knew about it, uh, rule that if you worked for the campaign, the more important your work was for securing, you know, the popular vote in a particular state or a particular city or locality, the better the job would be that you would get in the federal government when your side won. So this is also known as patronage. You know, so you give your supporters. So this is why people were willing to like go and spend all these volunteer hours working for campaigns, because they knew if their guy won, that they could actually get a job, which they could then exploit that job to, and, you know, take bribes, etc. You know, of course, it led to a lot of corruption, to you know, basically line their pockets for the next 4 years. Yeah, Ethan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask a question along that. It's like, what time in history did the, you know, populace start to see this as sort of a, you know, kind of a corrupt system, and that it's just a bunch of, you know, basically just I scratch your back, you scratch mine, and all that
Oh
sort
yeah,
of
yeah.
mess.
Again, like I mentioned before, it's in the 1880s. The spoils system will become so entrenched and so like everybody knows, you know, like what it is, that this guy who wants to be the ambassador to France and get the really nice gig of being living in Paris for 4 years will end up assassinating a president, President Garfield, in the 1880s, and that is going to cause popular, you know, opinion to turn against the spoils system, and a law to get passed at that time, the Pendleton Civil Service Act of
I would
1883.
I would think that the main problem with this is that there's like radical changes in the executive branch every single presidency.
Well,
So,
and also, like, it's people aren't necessarily interested in doing their job for the good of the country. They're interested in their own benefit, their own private benefit, and so bribery is commonplace. Like, people are using, because they're like, okay, I'm going to be in here for 4 years. I might be in here for another 4 if we win again, but for 4 years I'm in here, and I am going to like just use my office to benefit myself as much as I possibly can. I'm going to pay off all my debts. I'm going to get as much money as I can, etc. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of corruption.
Yeah, it seems kind of ironic from a president who ran against corruption is then just starting a system that births it.
Right, because the whole thing that it was the banks that had caused, like, it was
It
the
just it just shifted the bureaucracy.
right. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the Panic of 1819, that's not really what caused it. The Second Bank of the United States was trying to do the responsible thing and stop a bubble from getting bigger before it got too big. You know, it was land speculation that caused it. But Andrew Jackson, you know, was able to make it seem that way. So yes, truth and what people think is truth are often two very different things in politics. Autumn, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I just had a question.
Yeah.
How did it take for someone to be assassin for the system to be outlawed? Because I feel like it's so blatantly like not good. How did-
Yeah, I mean, right. You would think that people would want to reform it sooner. Again, it's just one of those things that kind of became endemic in the system, and everybody just accepted it as, oh, that's just the way things are, kind of thing. And it's not until it causes some kind of catastrophe that, you know, people are like, you know, and there are people, Autumn, don't get me wrong, that do want to reform things, but there's just not enough popular pressure to really get congressmen scared, you know, and congressmen are going to react when they're scared that the public's going to vote them out if they don't do something about it. So that's when they finally, you know, are motivated to change a system which really benefits them, you know. So I mean, it's a system that that really benefited people who were in the political world. So there wasn't a lot of motivation on the part of political people to change it, not until the public gets mad, and then they're like, oh crap, I'm going to get voted out if I don't do this. So then they do it. So, and actually there's a whole story that goes along with that, with the president, because they thought the president was going to veto it, but the president suddenly gets a noble streak, and he's part of a political machine. And there's two big political machines that are involved, and we're going to get to all that when we get to like the 1870s and 1880s. So there's a lot more that goes into it than just what we're mentioning now. But yeah, this is definitely going to change politics dramatically. All right. And that takes us to the Eaton affair. And so this is kind of the bubbling over of that that genteel class versus kind of the common folk class kind of thing that happens, you know, that has basically been under the surface this whole time. And by the way, if I forgot to mention this, John C. Calhoun, who had been vice president for John Quincy Adams, had switched sides and had basically run with Andrew Jackson. So he was vice president at the time, and in the Jackson administration. And basically, Jackson had brought in, like we mentioned, people who were not part of the genteel class. They were common folk more type people, and one of them was John Eaton, whose wife really was more common folk than he was. But you can see here's Peggy Eaton. She does look more plain than, you know, many of your women at the time who were, you know, you kind of tell she's more part of the common folk. And John C. Calhoun's wife, Floride Calhoun, did not like her because she was, you know, she wasn't part of this kind of upper class of people. And so she and the other ladies started shunning Peggy Eaton. And there was kind of this little social situation where they really like went over the top, like it was kind of mean girl stuff over the top against Peggy Eaton socially. And finally it caused so much strife and so much stress for the Eatons that John Eaton resigned his position as Secretary of War over the way his wife was being treated. And President Jackson actually tried to intervene on behalf of Peggy Eaton because his wife had died, like we mentioned, Rachel, and he felt like the genteel class was partially responsible for that. So this leads to you know, I mean, the affair is a very painful affair for the Eatons. It leads to Andrew Jackson seeing his vice president, John C. Calhoun, as an enemy more than as a friend. And it kind of leads to Calhoun's influence diminishing, and a kind of a little political operator from the North who had a way of pleasing people. He's kind of a kisser upper, so to speak, named Martin Van Buren, who was Secretary of State. His influence began to rise as a result of the Eaton affair. So that definitely is kind of a turning point as well in some ways. And that leads us to one of the great legends of and faith. Is this your slide?
No, it's not. I just had a
Oh, that
question.
question. What? No? Go ahead.
Sorry, I blanked for a second. Weren't presidents and vice presidents at the beginning kind of enemies anyway, because it was the person who lost who became vice president? Or so like, was this just more intense because the vice president actually started to lose influence? Or
No, that was changed by the 12th Amendment.
Yeah.
That was a problem until the 12th Amendment was passed. And once the 12th Amendment was passed, then that was no longer an issue. A president and vice president ran on the same ticket together. So Jackson and Calhoun were united by their shared hatred of John Quincy Adams, and so they had been political friends. But then, and Calhoun had a lot of influence with Jackson as a result. But then the Eaton affair and kind of the whole genteel versus common thing had basically caused Calhoun to lose influence and be seen as more of like part of that old genteel class, and not as much a man of the people as time went by. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, all right, Nick, what were you going to say?
How bad was Peggy Eaton treated? Because it caused her husband to just straight up resign from his position, so it must have been pretty bad, right?
I'm trying to give you a parallel here. My wife likes this show called Real Housewives. Have you anybody aware of that show? It's like a show where girls are in social situations and they're mean to each other. So I have to leave the room when that show goes on because I make fun of it too much. So I have to get out. But that's kind of what it's like. The Eaton affair is where they literally are shunning her and treating her very badly in social settings, and it is causing her so much stress that it's really she doesn't want to go to the functions that cabinet members are supposed to go to. She doesn't want to be there, and finally her husband just makes the decision to resign his position because his marriage is more important to him than his job. I don't know. Is there any other detail that you'd like me to give, Nick, on that?
No, it's just so, I guess, odd to me that all this would happen over just a cat fight, really.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny, but I think that it was getting to the point where John Eaton had to decide: do you want to stay Secretary of War, or do you want to lose, your marriage? And he chose, that he would rather have his marriage than have his job. So, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it is funny that something like that could cause such a political uproar, and that we could be talking about it nowadays. It would be that important. Faith, did you have anything else, or did you just forget to lower your hand?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Nick, did you have anything else, or did that answer that?
Yeah, that answered. Thank you.
Okay, you're no problem. Ethan, did you want to add to that?
Oh, I was kind of going. Wasn't kind of the attitude towards VPs is oh, I know I'm not gonna win president, so I'm just gonna kind of latch onto the back of this guy.
Well, I mean, a VP definitely had political, possibilities, you could say. But are you saying when they ran for VP? What are you asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you pick a VP based on areas of the country that you want to support you. Like if you're running together with that person. So oftentimes a VP would be picked because they knew that if that person was on the ticket, then people from that region or people from that particular political group would be more likely to vote for them. It's a way to get another group to come in, so to speak. Usually is what the motivation is for picking somebody. But there are other reasons as well. Does that answer your question, or did you want me to?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and then Kenzie, what were you going to say?
So John didn't go talk to the ladies who were messing with Peggy. Did he not do that?
From what I remember when I read about it, John C. Calhoun admonished his wife a little bit, but didn't like order her to stop. Like he was like, hey, you know, kind of, you need to cool it a little bit. But she was all, you know, mean girl, and was like, no, she's not part of the genteel class. You know, she's part of that group of people who came and walked and trod mud all over the White House carpets, you know. And so, yeah, his admonishment wasn't like strong enough to like stop his wife from doing what she did. So and really, you know, he is part of that genteel class and doesn't like those kind of outsiders coming in, and was hoping to influence Jackson into more of a genteel direction, but it didn't work out. So
That's whack.
yeah, I mean that's as much as I remember anyway from when I read about it. Scott, what were you gonna say?
So going back on that VP thing, an example of the president pulling votes with his VP be like how Trump pulled Pence to get conservative votes, just that kind of same principle.
Yeah, it's like sometimes it's like, hey, this person is a really important person in the party. It's kind of like, quote unquote, almost their turn. They're like really influential senator, really influential governor, etc. Or, hey, this person represents this region of the country. But yeah, Mike Pence was, I believe, and this is just, you know, there's a lot of speculation on this, but he was kind of the more reserved, you know, status quo conservative that was needed to kind of balance out Trump's, you know, wild man image, you know, like of just being this rough and, you know, ready New York businessman who just spoke his mind and didn't care what people thought, you know, kind of thing. So trying to balance that out and keep, you know, the conservative, kind of the more established conservative wing of the party happy. Now, of course, if anybody else has some analysis on that, you know, they want to add, that's fine too. But that's kind of how I saw it, and I think that's the consensus on that. And Kenzie, did you have anything else, or did you just have your hand raised?
No, I forgot to put it down.
Oh, no problem. All right, so hey, speaking of men of the common people, we have another one, which is another guy from Tennessee named Davy Crockett. I'm sure you've probably heard of him, actually. He fought the Creeks in the War of 1812. He was part of that volunteer force, and then he got into politics. And he could regale people with these colorful stories of his fights to survive on the frontier. And he was so good at telling frontier stories that people would invite him over to their houses for dinner parties so he could speak and entertain them. And they would give him gifts. Like, for instance, he had this long rifle that he affectionately called Betsy, that was given to him as a gift while he was attending a conference in Philadelphia. And he kind of traveled the country almost as a folk hero. People out east wanted to hear him, you know, entertain the party with his stories of, you know, what it was like on the frontier when he faced this situation or that situation. And in 1826, he ran for office. He ran to be a congressman on the platform of squatters' rights, which is like where if you go onto a piece of land that hadn't been developed by a person who owned it, and you were on there for a certain number of years, that you should just basically get ownership of it, because the person who owned it was never doing anything. Is something that in law is still actually a principle in law. It's called adverse possession, where you basically just, somebody has land and they never do anything with it. They never take care of it. They never do anything. And you go and you just, you're basically there for 20 years and they don't boot you out. Then you can basically just claim ownership and just get the deed transferred over to you through a process known as adverse possession. Yeah, Ethan, what were you going to say?
So this was over property that has already been owned before and is not unowned, right?
Right. Somebody has the deed to it, and
Yeah.
it may be like
So
someone who inherited it from like a relative, and they don't even really like know that they have it, or they do know, but it's like they don't really care. You know, they
yeah,
don't do anything with
I
it.
was thinking like, wasn't adverse possession already kind of assumed from like, because it was in British government for like the
Yes,
longest time.
it's part of law, but again, there are people who want to continue to expand that, and there are other people who want to, keep it from being established because they want, land to stay in their possession. And so he kind of comes down on the side of
Oh yeah.
waters.
I actually saw a lot about specifically adverse possession. I think it started out in like in Britain in the medieval times when people were claiming city left and right, and it was mainly because the crown was lazy, so they just assumed that anyone who was who is living in that castle owned it.
Well, right. And
And
it's also a motivation. Like if you own land, you have to maintain it. You can't just own it and never do anything
well,
with it.
there's a lot of like specifically, it's not as easy to do this because one, the owner of the property has to not be on the property at all within
Right.
like the claim limit.
Like, and if they try to evict you from the property, like nowadays, adverse possession is still on the law books in most states, and it's 20 years.
Yeah,
If
I
they try
think
to evict you from any time within those 20 years, then the adverse possession claim is null and void. They have to do nothing
I
for
think
20 years.
nowadays, the only thing people use it for is if like there's a difference in property lines between your neighbor and you actually there's a fence that's not on the property line. And if
That's more like, I mean, that's more easement law.
yeah.
What you're getting into is various forms of property law, and that's more easements
Yeah.
and things like that, which again, we don't have time to get into all that, but
Yeah, basically just the thing that people mainly used it for is if nobody's living here, then I just gonna take it.
right, squatters' rights. So yes, Chase, what were we gonna say?
Okay, I know Davy Crockett was like really popular and ran for politics and stuff, but did he ever like influence anyone to go out onto the frontier themselves? Or was he
People,
just there for like the stories?
people did like go and try to have adventures similar to his, and actually he will end up down in the Alamo, which we're going to talk about, and there were people who went there because they had heard that Davy Crockett was going there, and they went to kind of help in this kind of adventure to stop the Mexican army from attacking Americans living in the Tejas region of Mexico. So um, yeah, I mean, he does influence people to get involved in things, and the people that he influenced to get involved in the Alamo, of course, would pay with their lives because you. I don't know if you know the story of the Alamo, but we're going to get to what happens to him and all of the other people there when we get to that slide. But yeah, yes, he is very influential in getting people to kind of go out and have adventures like his. And Olivia, what were you going to say?
I guess I just need clarification. I know he already kind of got a status from the Creeks and stuff, but how does that give him a political platform from that and him influencing people to go out and adventure for themselves? I'm just kind of confused on how that gives
I mean,
him a
again,
win.
he was someone that people knew about. There were newspaper articles that referenced him and his adventures. There were people who wrote down some of his stories, which is why we still have them. And those stories got published, and they were in print in various areas. Plus, there were people who just talked about it, word of mouth. And he made the frontier sound like a fun place to be. Like, hey, this time when this bear came up, and I was like, yeah. And he had a way of like making it very entertaining, and making it seem like it was a place where you could have all kinds of adventures, but you'd always come out on top in the end, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, it was a combination of those things like that really kind of propelled him. I mean, we wouldn't even know about his adventures unless people had written them down. So those did circulate. And it did give him a platform where he eventually was able to run for Congress and become a politician. But he doesn't, he's more of a rival of Jackson's. Like Jackson's like, okay, hey, you have to do what we say. Like Jackson had like this set thing where if you did what he said, then he would support you. And if you scratched his back, he scratch yours. But if you didn't do it, if you went against the policies he wanted, then he would try to get you out of office. Like it was, that was the way he kind of ran things. And so Davy Crockett was kind of independent, and he's like, yeah, I'm like you, but I'm not going to just do everything you say. And so he actually ends up losing his seat in Congress as a result of that. Nick, what were you going to say?
So basically what I'm getting is this man just got into power because he was charismatic. That was basically it.
A lot of it is he's just really good at telling stories at dinner parties, but he did have adventures too. And he was kind of seen as this man of the people. And that was something that was politically popular at the time. So, he's playing up to what people want at the time. I mean, Andrew Jackson had made his political fortune off of being a man of the people. And so here's another guy who is making his political fortune in the same way. Is that kind of what you were asking, Nick?
Yeah. Just another thing, what like policy did they not agree on? Because they're like very kind of similar backgrounds, but they didn't get along. What was that about?
Oh, I'm trying to remember what it was. I can't remember exactly, but there was some issue, and it was a Tennessee issue. And Crockett refused to go along with Jackson on it. And I mean, honestly, it's just escaping my memory what it was. But that was, that's the way Jackson ran things. Either you do what we want and we support you and you're on our team, or you're on your own and we'll actually try to get you out and get somebody who's on our team in your spot. And that's kind of how Crockett ends up losing his seat. I wish I could remember that though. Sorry. Ethan, what were you going to say?
Did Davy Crockett ever encourage people to like move out onto the frontier with his stories?
Again, some people were inspired to go out and kind of live the frontier lifestyle because of the stories they heard about him. Yes.
Like, did that help with like, establishing more control into the U.S. territory?
Well,
in any way?
agree. And there's like, remember, our territory only extends at this point through the Louisiana Purchase. We don't have, and most of that area is very sparsely populated because the Great Plains tribes are powerful. Like you don't mess with them. So essentially, yes, there is a frontier, and people do have adventures in it, but we by no means have like conquered the great vast wildernesses of the West. And of course, much of it is still at this time owned by Mexico.
So it's mainly like just Kentucky, Tennessee, and those areas.
Well, I mean, and then little areas like Arkansas Territory south of Mississippi, and then, I'm sorry, south of Missouri, and then other areas in Louisiana Purchase that are relatively close to well-established states. But yeah, those kind of areas are really the frontier areas at the time. And many states still had large, wild areas in them that had not yet been tamed. Does that answer your question, Ethan?
Yes.
All right. And Dylan, go ahead.
Is the Davy Crockett movies realistic at all?
To a certain extent. Which movie are you referring to?
I can't remember which one it was, but I remember watching one about Davy Crockett.
Yeah, you'd have to like ask me like which movie, because some movies are a little more like accurate to his life than others. But generally speaking, Hollywood has kind of ginned up his story a little bit to make it more frontiers-ish, man, and less glad-handing politician, man. You know what I'm saying? They really emphasize the frontier side, and they don't emphasize as much that this guy is just really good at schmoozing, which a lot of his popularity and his ability to become famous come from his ability to do well at dinner parties and be entertaining. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but is that kind of what you were looking for? All
yeah,
right.
it was.
Okay. And then Olivia, what were we going to say?
This is just my own curiosity. I know he influenced people that the frontier life was interesting, but did people actually go out and do that and then not like it? I guess would that kind of backfire for
Well,
him
I mean,
politically?
there were definitely people who tried to be frontiersmen and found out that the frontier life was not for them. And so, but does that hurt Davy Crockett politically? Not necessarily. They're just like, well, I'm just not as tough as him, or I'm not as good at it as him. But it isn't as glamorous as he makes it sound. Um, but again, Americans have this fascination with kind of the struggle with the wilderness and the frontier because that is a part of who we are. It's a part of our country's character. The frontier has always been there ever since the beginning of the country. The Native Americans, the wild animals, the having to live by your wits out in the wilderness kind of thing. Being resourceful and brave and independent is just all something that is part of our political and national culture. It's been there ever since the beginning when the 13 colonies were established. All right, that takes us to one of the great slave revolts in our history. As a matter of fact,
Dr. Johnson,
yes.
this is my slide.
Okay, all right. So thank you for saying something because I get on a roll. So go ahead, Eiley, and tell us the story here because this is probably considered to be the most serious of all the slave revolts.
Okay, so Nat Turner's slave revolt, pretty interesting. Nathaniel Turner's his full name. He was a very religious slave, and he preached to other slaves, and basically they were like, "Oh, you're the prophet of God," and he was like, "Yeah." So one day he saw an eclipse of the sun, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, it's a sign from God. Let's go kill my plantation owners." So he gathers. I looked at multiple
All right.
sources for this, and it says like four. It's either 4, 6, or 7 slaves that he gathers. But he
Yeah.
gathers a number of slaves and goes and murders his owner and the family.
All right. So stop there for a sec.
Yeah.
You said that he was deeply religious. Did he have a skill that slave owners often found was like something they didn't want their slaves to have? Like,
Oh, yeah. Wasn't he literate? Like he could
yes,
read and write?
he had learned how to read and write. And again, sometimes like a family member would take pity on a slave and say, "Hey, let me teach you how to read." And he did have kind of this knowledge of the Bible, a very deep knowledge of the Bible, which inspired a lot of his thoughts of like, hey, this situation that I'm in right now is not the way it's supposed to be. I am not supposed to be.
Yeah.
But then of course he kind of like said, well, I'm a prophet and I can prophesy things. And so he had dreams and but we do have a very interesting primary source. It's called the Confessions of Nat Turner, which was developed out of an interview that someone did with him while he was in prison awaiting execution. It's really chilling in a lot of ways, but just because he is so honest about exact details of what he did during this slave revolt. So they kill the white family on this plantation. Like every man, woman, and child is killed. A lot of them while they were sleeping. And then tell us what happens next.
So also I just wanted to add when you said that he was literate and could read and write. I didn't write this down, but I feel like I read somewhere that the daughter of his plantation owner was the one who taught him to read and write.
Right. Yeah. It was.
I don't remember if that's true or not, though.
Yes, I'm pretty sure that's right. I am pretty sure that,
Okay.
that was how it worked. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So after they massacre and murder the family, he and the other slaves escape the plantation, and they secure arms and horses to help with their rebellion. And then they begin to travel from plantation to plantation, just killing white families. And they recruit up to around 75 other slaves in the rebellion. And this lasted for about 48 hours until they were confronted by the Virginia State Militia and kind of just shot down. Well, not shot, but like captured and
Yeah, well,
disbanded and stuff.
yeah. Nat Turner,
Then
some of his followers, they escape into the swamps in the midst of that battle, and he actually is a wanted man for like 6 weeks
murder.
before they finally find him.
Yeah. He escapes to the swamp, like some of his rebellion, or not rebellion. Yeah, some of his rebellion and followers do. But he escapes to the swamp and hides for 6 weeks before someone sees him and is like, "Oh, that's you." And then they kind of just capture him, and he gets hanged and executed.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
they had packs of dogs, and they had posses out there looking for him. Like, he was being hunted for a while because he was considered a threat to Virginia's like existence. So because there's a huge number of slaves, and they don't want slaves getting the idea that they should rise up and revolt. But go ahead. Sorry.
I didn't realize it. He was being hunted. I thought someone just found him and was like, "Oh,
Yeah,
look me."
no, I mean, and right. I don't know if he was cited by a person but like there were posses out looking for him. There were dogs, etc. They were trying to find him. So there was a concerted effort
Yeah.
to capture him. Yeah.
So after he was captured and hanged, after the 6 weeks where he was captured and hanged, he was hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia, which is a town in Virginia, not in the Mediterranean. 16 of his followers were hanged as well. This thing, hold on.
That's fine.
Just a quick moment.
Okay. And while Eiley is away, I had a student, and this is like almost 20 years.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Yeah, I was just relating while you were away that I had a student, this was like almost 20 years ago, who did a performance for National History Day based off of the Confessions of Nat Turner, and he actually just memorized portions of Nat Turner's, like, the Confessions of Nat Turner, and it was chilling. Like, it was so good. Like he basically just described how they killed like the families and just went in and just a really powerful, like, it gave you a window into how slaves felt and what a slave revolt looked like from the inside. So it's just stuck with me ever since. I still remember it. It's just an excellent job that this kid did. But anyway, Eiley, go ahead.
So, yeah, after this whole public execution, and well, I don't remember if it was public or not, but after the execution, this whole thing resulted in many different things. It struck a lot of fear in the hearts of Southerners because, like, there were slaves beginning to rise up and kill everyone. They were like, "Oh no, we're gonna be murdered in the middle of the night. That's not good."
Right.
It also resulted in harsher slave laws.
Yes.
And it deepened the gap between slaveholders and free soilers or abolitionists.
Right. I mean, when your very life is on the line and the lives of your family, that was the worst nightmare of slave owners in the South, was to wake up in the middle of the night and see their slaves over them, standing
Yeah.
up with weapons, ready to kill them. So it was their worst nightmare. Lauren, what were you going to say?
I was just curious about the plantation that the family was on. Since
Yeah.
the slaves escaped, what happened to the plantation?
I can answer that, but I'll let Eiley do it first if you'd like. Eiley?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What happened to the plantation after the revolt?
I couldn't hear the question.
Lauren asked what happened to the plantation, that Nat Turner had been on after his revolt. So like the family was wiped out.
That's a good question. I didn't find anything on that, but I'd assume in that case, either someone bought the land, someone just moved onto it, or maybe like distant family took it.
It basically,
or it could have been abandoned.
Yeah, no, it goes to the next of kin. Like, it basically, like, somebody would inherit it. So if there was no will already made out, then the person, they say, dies intestate, meaning that they don't have a testament or a will to say who property goes to, and then they just look for the next of kin. And there's like a whole list of how, you know, you figure out who is next of kin, and then they would just show up at that person's house and they'd say, hey, you have inherited this land because you are the next of kin. So it's basically property, and you know, property law would apply. And that would apply not only to the actual plantation itself, but to any slaves who were on it that were still, you know, like, you know, considered not dangerous. They were considered property too, and they would also be inherited by somebody. So, Autumn, did you have a question? Autumn?
Yeah, sorry. If he was so religious, why did he take this sign from God as something to blatantly go against the Bible for, like killing people?
Yeah, I mean, and children,
Do you
like
know why?
they killed, like if you read the Confessions of Nat Turner, like it wasn't just the adults, it was little kids too that they killed. Um, well, he considered himself sort of like this messianic figure, this kind of, you know, like Moses, you know, the Egyptians, they had to die, all those Egyptian soldiers that were chasing the Jews when they were trying to escape from slavery. And, you know, the plagues on Egypt, where the first, you know, the worst one was where the firstborn son was killed, you know. So that, I mean, if you're fighting for the freedom of your people, certain things are justified, apparently, you know. I mean, obviously he's breaking, you know, the 10 commandments when he was killing people, but he felt like it was justified because he was fighting for a higher good, for the freedom of his people. I don't know if that, Eiley, did you want to add anything to that at all, or?
I was responding to that question. I was kind of thinking the same thing, where his motives were obviously powered by anger, which is not good. But a lot of his ideas most likely came from Exodus, like you were saying, where Moses was leading his people out of slavery. And so, like you said, because of the plagues that happened and all this death occurred to the people who were causing the slavery, he was probably like, well, it's just, even though it's not.
Yeah, it's it's definitely an interesting topic. Again, I wish we had time to go through the Confessions of Nat Turner in detail, but if you ever get a chance, highly recommend it. But that was the impression I got when I read those, you know, and as I saw my student, you know, a long time ago actually act some of those out. Faith, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to ask, so did he also kill the woman who taught him to read, the daughter of the family?
From what I remember, it was one of the other slaves that did it, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if, especially if he became very religious due to being able to read the Bible and everything, I feel like he wouldn't want to kill the person who made that accessible to him.
Yeah.
You know?
But at the same time, that person owned him, right? There was that unequal relationship, you know, based in fear. And at the very, very heart of it, you know, it's still like, you still are my slave. I still own you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
I was just curious.
that may justify the willingness to kill. But go ahead, Braden. What were you gonna say?
Oh, so you said that he only had like 75 people with him?
In the end, because it was like the Stono Rebellion. It like they would go from plantation to plantation. They would get slaves on their side. They would kill the white family, and then they would go to the next plantation. So as they continued to kind of like go from plantation to plantation, they kept recruiting more and more of, you know, people who had been slaves but were now rebelling against the system.
Yeah, so if they kept like going from plantation to plantation, like recruiting people, like I guess why wouldn't they have more people backing them up? Because I feel like
Well, Eiley, I'll let you answer this first, but I can answer that question. Did you want to try to take a stab at that, or Eiley? Okay.
I'm sorry, what?
Did you want to try to answer that question that Braden just asked? Why didn't they have more slaves if they had gone from plantation to plantation? What would be the
Well,
deterrent to
they did
like,
have more slaves. They started with 4 to 7 and then grew up to 75.
right? But
Every time they
he's
finished
thinking there
plantation,
should
they
be hundreds and hundreds, like there were, like in the Stono Rebellion, there was definitely more slaves involved.
Oh, a lot of the slaves didn't really agree with the idea of murder.
Well, it wasn't necessarily the idea of murder, but they were what? Afraid. Like they knew what would happen if they were involved, and they were like, it's never
Yeah.
going to work. You know, like I'm not going to put myself on the line and get killed. You know, I'm not
Yeah.
getting involved in this. It's stupid, you know. So, to answer your question, Braden, there was a lot of fear. Remember how, you know, we talked about when you were young as a slave and you saw people being, you know, whipped and beaten and whatnot, and how it just kind of left these psychological scars on you.
Yeah.
That's, you know, there is this debate, like, why didn't this vast population of slaves revolt more often? Because really the Nat Turner slave revolt is the last slave revolt we're going to talk about. And then, you know, even during the Civil War, you would expect slaves to revolt, and it didn't happen. And again, a lot of it comes back to this kind of this psychological scarring that happens when people are young and they watch kind of the brutality of what happens when you go against the master. And of course, then, you know, rumors of what happened when people tried to revolt and it didn't work and they all died. It all kind of, you know, influences people to not get involved. You know, so there are slaves that just are like, nope, I don't want to have anything to do with this. You all go and do your thing, but I'm staying out of it, kind of thing, because I don't want to die. Um, but you know, and there were others who wanted to overthrow the system, and you can't blame them for wanting to overthrow the system, because it's a horrible system, and it's exploiting them in a terrible way. Um, does that answer your question, or did you?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's exactly what I wanted to hear.
Okay, all right. And Ethan, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just go based on assumption that the next of kin who received the property, both meaning the land and the slaves, would they really not want the slaves, even though they were said to not be dangerous, because they kind of feel like the place would be cursed after, you know, the entire family got murdered?
Are you saying would they feel like these people are dangerous?
Like, would they just like sell them off and just?
That's very possible. Like, you inherit the property, you can sell it. Like, you don't necessarily have to go and take possession of it. And a good slave could fetch anywhere from hundreds up to, you know, over $1,000, which at the time was a lot of money. So, right, oftentimes when people inherited property, they didn't necessarily go and take possession of the property. They just sold it. It all depends on what your situation is. If you have property of your own already and you don't necessarily need it, you know.
Yeah, I was just guessing based off of that the slaves were involved in this horrible revolt, that they wouldn't really want it.
Well, also, but think about it. If you have slaves on that property who had the opportunity, like all the white people are dead, and they had the opportunity to join a revolt and they didn't, wouldn't that say that they're more like safe to be around because they could have been a part of it, but they didn't? You know, they weren't a part of
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I can see what you mean by, you know, still carry the title of, oh, that was the place where that happened.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where you're wondering, is this is it safe to go here now that this happened? And you know, you might definitely be willing to consider selling it, but just remember that owning a plantation was the ticket to being in that wealthy upper class, that genteel class, and that was the aspiration of every white person in the South, was to style themselves as a Southern gentleman.
Yeah, that part would just kind of feel like basically the plot to some weird 1800s horror story. Like, oh, there's a slave revolt used to be in this house, but you get to be rich.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think the most interesting debate really is, why weren't there more slave revolts? Like, because the black population in the South was so huge compared to the white population.
I'm guessing at that point it's like we're never gonna get out of this. We just have to accept it that we're just gonna be crushed if we do that.
I mean, and the argument that I've heard that is the most convincing to me is that there is just so much psychological scarring from a young age, from watching people being whipped and tortured and whatnot, that it has a tendency to kind of breed this I don't know. I don't want to say fear, because I feel like a lot of slaves were very brave people and did a lot to not even if they weren't able to like openly revolt, but to resist the system. But I feel like, as you made, emotional connections to other slaves, as you had children, and as you thought about the consequences of what could happen, not just to yourself but to everybody you cared about, it made you hesitate to get
So
involved.
I also have a question. Did slaves at the time have like an accurate like representation of like just how many of them were there, or is it kind of like in confusion of
No.
how many slaves there were?
There was, because of the 3/5 compromise. Remember
Okay.
that in order for Southern states
Yeah.
to get representation in the House of Representatives, 3/5 of the state population, of the slave population, was counted in as people who would be part of the, like apportionment of seats. So no, there's a very accurate counts so when they filled out the census, they filled out
No, I'm saying not from like the federal government. I'm saying like the slaves themselves. Did they know?
Did they know what? They
Like
were
just how many of them were in the United States?
they weren't allowed to read and write. No, they were.
Yeah, so they probably felt like there's a lot less of them than they actually were.
They were just stuck in their little world, right? Yeah, they didn't know like the larger picture of things, and they kept them as illiterate and as exhausted as they possibly could.
I'm guessing that contributed a bit to it.
Yes, that also contributes to it as well. Yes, I agree with you there. All right, I have a couple more questions to get to. Zachary, go ahead.
All right, so I understand the killing of like the men and women, but did they like kill the children because they were in like a bloodlust, or was it just because that their family had owned them?
I mean, it all depends on
Like,
the slave who's
what do you think the reason behind them killing children was?
Well, it all depends on who's leading it and like what their motivations are. Because you remember the wasn't Denmark Vesey, it was Gabriel Prosser's slave revolt. He's like, we're going to kill all white people except for Quakers, Methodists, and one other group. And so they were like, some slaves were like, okay, we're going to kill everybody. And some slaves are like, no, we're only going to kill certain groups of people. Certain whites are bad and other whites aren't. But really, I mean, the answer to your question is that in this particular instance, Nat Turner saw the white race as the enemy, and that all people who were part of that, whether they be young or old, were kind of complicit in this horrible institution that was degrading and killing their children, and causing all kinds of horrible abuses to take place of them. So I don't know if that answers your question, Zach, but
Yeah, it does. It answers.
I was
my
just
question.
gonna ask, it's like, wouldn't they probably see that the like white children there would just be their future owners?
Right. Yeah. You can consider them, the enemy, if that was how you saw things. Max, what were you going to say?
Oh, this is probably from like way earlier in the discussion, but did Nat Turner preach to a specific like doctrine, like Presbyterian or Methodist, or did he just go off the Bible and preach his own thing?
No, he learned how to read and write, and basically was able to basically formulate his own version of kind of the Christian, out like worldview. I mean, he had his own version, but he was very influenced by the Old Testament stories of Moses leading his people to freedom, the Israelites being slaves in Egypt and resisting that slavery and fighting back and not just accepting it, and that sort of thing. And so he kind of, and then he of course he had dreams, and he considered those dreams to be messages from God. And so he kind of conflated a lot of things. He wasn't exactly what you would call a doctrinal purist. He's not like, gee, how does this work out logically? Like he just kind of came up with his own take on things. And a lot of that is colored by his experience. He just, the thing that is right in front of them all the time is slavery. I mean, it is what consumes his life. And so that becomes the focus. And so when he's looking at the Bible, he's looking at it through that lens. What about slavery? Oh, hey, they were slaves, but they revolted. That was considered a good thing. Moses is a hero, that sort of thing. So I don't know if that really answers your question. But did you have anything else that you wanted to add? You still had your hand up, Max.
Oh yeah. If we can get to it, so he knew he wanted to kill the plantation owners, and he knew he wanted to free other slaves. But after that, what was his end game? Did he even have a plan of what he was going to do once he had amassed people and gone through all of these
in terms
plantations?
of like where are we going to go after this sort of thing? Like, is there an escape plan like Denmark Vesey? No. As far as I remember, all he wanted to do was just eradicate the white race in every area that they were in, like, so to speak, like that slaves were living, that they were going to eradicate white people. And that was as far as his thinking went. Of course, Denmark Vesey had a much more, elaborate plan, but he was much more well educated, and he understood the world. He was from Haiti, so he understood what was out there beyond the little plantation that beyond Charleston, South Carolina, where he lived. So yeah. Cody, did you have anything you wanted to add? I see your hand. Cody Sparkman.
Yeah. Actually, I had a question. How far? I know they went on for 48 hours, but how far did they travel from their original plantation?
How many plantations? Eiley, do you remember exactly from your reading how many plantations there were that were they got to within that 48 hours?
I want to say somewhere between 7 to 15, but it might have been more. I don't think I read about it, but
I
with
like
the
the number
slaves.
7. The number 7 came back into my mind too, but I'm not it's been a little while since I've read the story, so I'm not exactly sure. Go ahead.
It wasn't a huge amount, but it wasn't a super low amount either. So it might, I think, somewhere around 7 to 15, like that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I think that's probably as close as we're going to get until we, look up that detail. But yeah, this is the last great slave revolt. And just as a way of kind of finishing this off, slave owners are going to really crack down on everything that they believe contributes to slave revolts, including literacy. But also, it just makes them much more afraid of abolitionists and abolitionist ideas filtering into the South, because again, their worst nightmare is this situation here. And just remember that there's 2 patterns for slave revolts. There's the, hey, let's get everybody together and take out a city, and that's Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey's revolts. And then there's the, hey, let's go from one plantation to another and just keep gathering slaves as we go. And that is the Stono Rebellion and the Nat Turner Revolt. So that was a great conversation we had, and it looks like we've hit our 2-hour limit. So we will stop here for today, and we will pick up with the Mormons when I see you guys in class on Wednesday. All right. So thanks everybody for being a part, and we will see you then.
Wait, hold on. You said Wednesday?
Right, because Wait a minute. Oh, is a B? Oh, I'm sorry. Monday. Yeah,
Yeah.
my B day 80 thing is all messed up in my head. Yeah, I will see you guys.
Okay.
I will see you on
So do
Monday.
you know then what since Tuesday we're not doing school? What
Right.
is Wednesday?
Wednesday then is an A day. So then
Okay.
I would see you on Thursday again. So I'd see you Monday and I'd see you Thursday of next week.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. See you all later, and thanks for being a part.
Adios.
Adios. Have a good weekend.